Hi, everyone. Once again, I'm Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe podcast. Thank you very much for joining me on the penultimate episode of 2020. I'm very pleased to share this interview I conducted a little while back with Jonathan Cohn. He is an assistant professor of digital cultures and head of the digital humanities program at the University of Alberta. And we are talking about his book, The Burden of Choice: Recommendations, Subversion, and Algorithmic Culture. Obviously, a very apropos book of a lot of things being discussed this year, previous years, and inevitably in the future as well. I found it a really helpful way of understanding some of these things that are so amorphous and all around us that sometimes we don't even realize it. But it's not just obviously algorithms that tell you maybe you should buy this if you bought this on Amazon or what have you, but also the way we get our news, the way we get our information about virtually everything going on in the world today, especially when we're at home during COVID. So these algorithmic processes are happening all the time. We probably don't quite understand just how important they are, although we can see their repercussions in many ways. One thing I really liked about this that we highlight in the interview is that Jonathan talks about how we can subvert this process and fight back against sort of this top-down approach that a lot of us are concerned with. So anyway, as always, you can check out more from Jonathan and other guests at tinapp.org. You can support the show by sending a coffee, which also goes to books and other things like that. You can share this, I hope, online. You can leave a review. And without further ado, let's get to it. Jonathan, thank you so much for talking to me today. As always, I'd love to start with just a basic sort of synopsis about your book, The Burden of Choice, and how it came together. What were you doing that led you to eventually this monograph?
Sure. Okay. So The Burden of Choice came out of my dissertation. So it was an extremely long-term project. I focused on, at least at the beginning, I was really interested in just the way websites recommended things to people. This was in 2005 or 2007. So there wasn't a whole lot of stuff being written about that at that point. I was interested in kind of how it worked, but also the effect that it was having on people. And also just all those strange things that kept popping up in my recommendations. It seemed like a lot of the rhetoric in popular culture around recommendation systems and around the way Facebook was working, Twitter too. There was such a big focus on how these technologies were creating kind of niches or filtering people, but also kind of putting people into tiny categories and not allowing them to see other groups of people out there. I was kind of interested in just sort of thinking through like, well, if that's true, then why am I getting so many weird things in my recommendations? And why am I still able to come across kind of new things? Why does serendipity still work? It's supposed to be, these technologies are kind of supposed to get rid of serendipity in a way, but they keep it somehow. So that was kind of where it started. And then I started thinking about just very early on in my dissertation, it was very, very technical. I was doing a lot of research on like the history of barcodes and how stores were using data in various ways from the 50s onwards. But at some point, my dissertation advisor kind of told me like, basically like this stuff is not very interesting. And
barcodes are not interesting?
Barcodes are not very interesting, apparently. It was like slightly. Now I see this stuff in print, and I'm like, oh, I guess that is publishable, but it's not that interesting. I couldn't figure out what I wanted to say about barcodes. She kind of pointed out, that I was saying a lot of interesting stuff about people like Patty Maas or the group lens people, and was wondering if I had more to say around like sex, gender, race. And suddenly I realized that I had totally neglected that section or like those issues. And suddenly that's what my dissertation became focused on. It's like my dissertation is called Post-feminist technologies, which is very different from this particular book, but it definitely morphed into this project.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that struck me about this book is that you wouldn't necessarily think of it if I asked, random people on the street, what's the most important or pressing issue of the day? They wouldn't necessarily say something like algorithmic recommendations. But at the same time, as I looked at your book, I realized like this can help us explain. Maybe it's not the only reason, but it helps explain sort of why Trump was elected or how Trump was elected. It helps explain sort of why protests are going on right now, in a sense, in terms of who's seeing what information. I think it very much helps us understand why people are on picket lines in different places in the world, but also here. It explains so much that's going on, why people are buying certain things, why people are acting in certain ways or believing certain things to exist or be an issue. So the algorithmic recommendation systems that are out there actually are central to so many questions. How do you start to unpack that? Once you start to really see that it's everywhere, I mean, then you're almost studying everything. So it seems like actually a really big topic, but you managed it. I'm curious about how you started to structure that analysis.
Oh, it was really hard. It was really hard. I think I stopped writing this around 2012, or at least that's when my dissertation finished. And things were just continually coming out in the news around these topics. So it was really hard to just build the corpus and decide when to stop. Mm-hmm. But at some point, I had to make it a little bit historical rather than totally contemporary, just to both save myself, but also because the present is too confusing to me in a way. And I thought the history would be really helpful for kind of explaining how we got to this point. The early period is also kind of interesting just because people were much more, or like engineers and scientists, they were much more interested in discussing the problems and kind of the effects that these things could have on culture, and also like the philosophical issues around this stuff. They were just trying to like figure out what makes like a subject and how you can kind of cater to that person. Part of my method, I guess, was first to like try to figure out how to search for these things on Google or on other search engines, which was incredibly difficult, at least early on, just because these things didn't have like a particularly easily searchable name or category. It's like a lot of people weren't calling them recommendation systems. A lot of people weren't calling them collaborative filters. They were calling them other things entirely, just calling them predictive text engines or who knows what else. So it's just really hard to search for these things. And a lot of the things that I found were just through kind of just experimenting with search terms. A lot of the more interesting things I found were just people telling me about interesting people or interesting projects like Group Lens and Patty Maas. Patty Maas I found just because my brother-in-law told me about her, and I don't think I would have ever found her otherwise or heard anything about her.
Yeah, and I want to talk about those like specific chapters and the examples you use. But before, I'm curious how you would sort of explain to someone, especially someone who hasn't picked up your book yet, like what's at stake? What is the big deal about algorithms, recommendation systems? It may sound vaguely familiar to people who don't study it or who aren't, particularly looking into that stuff. But as I said before, it's actually super important once you start to think about it the way that you do in the book. So what's at stake?
Sure,
yeah, what are we talking about when you're mentioning these things?
Great. So recommendation systems, they're like a very quotidian technology that we use every day, if not multiple times an hour. And we're not necessarily always just using them. Sometimes they're just happening in front of us. I mean, I think anybody who uses the internet right now is aware of how recommendation systems work and kind of the effects that they can have on people. But I see this a lot on YouTube right now. That's a technology that I don't even talk about in the book really, because like when I was writing this book, it was kind of like their recommendation systems were kind of almost Dadaist, like very absurd in how they would kind of link things together. But now we see lots and lots of stories about people on YouTube who go in trying to find one thing and are continually recommended things or the way the YouTube recommender seems to work at least is that you go in looking for one thing and it continually tries to recommend more and more intense pieces of media to you until you end up in either like a far right or a far left camp. Mm-hmm. So people who only get their news through YouTube or only get their media through a particular channel end up getting kind of pushed into a certain category. They only get to see certain kinds of arguments being made and don't get to see everybody else's arguments or kind of the larger stakes behind things. So I was pretty interested in both sort of how these technology, at least early on, I was interested in how these technologies kind of were transforming us, how they were transforming how we think, the kinds of things that we were able to think, and the kinds of possibilities that were open to us. So early on, I was also kind of thinking about just like what kind of destabilizing what it means to make a choice and who gets to make choices. What does that mean? Why are some people not able to even make a choice? Some people are kind of defined as people who can make choices and others as people who can't. So like an example of that would be, I don't know, I feel like I'm rambling here.
No. This is good. Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
I'm just thinking actually what struck me that I'd never thought about before was the way you highlight sort of the history of the words, religious connotations in many senses, of suggestions, recommendations, and then how that's changed. So yeah, maybe you could say a little bit about that too.
Sure. Yeah. For the first chapter of that book, the difference between recommendations and suggestions, I started off by taking a lot of ideas from Raymond Williams and his methodology and keywords of just going through like the long history of a term and seeing how it's changed over time and how it creates kind of debates, how a word kind of can hold within it a debate within society. So for me, that debate was around recommendations and just like, what is a choice? What is a recommendation? Why do we, when is it a good idea to take somebody's advice and when isn't it? Is that a form of temptation or is it a form of agency? And kind of I was so fascinated by how all of those ideas were kind of trapped within the singular word. So started doing kind of more of a historical, like a long historical look at how those words have changed over time or not. It's also like I pull that out for grad students too, because it looks so impressive methodologically, but it's kind of just takes like a couple of looks at OED. OED has thankfully already kind of done a lot of that work for me. But just seeing how a term like recommendation and suggestion gets used totally differently in the Bible, where recommendations always come from God and they're always positive, versus suggestion, which is always coming from the devil and is always a form of temptation and will lead you to your doom eventually, or it's a sinnable offense.
Mm-hmm.
Now we just use those two words completely interchangeably. It was actually incredibly difficult to like this book could have been extremely wordy or just had the word recommendation on almost in every paragraph. It was hard to find and use these words in a way that I wanted them to mean, but also in the way that they get used. It's hard to make that decision. What were you thinking about specifically interesting in around history of good choices?
Yeah, I think if you take the idea of some sort of all-powerful, whether that's all-powerfully good or all-powerfully bad entity, as we tend to do in stories like the Bible, it's interesting that you can then kind of attach that to things like Amazon, which is probably what most people think of in terms of recommendation systems now, because I think very similar things are happening. I mean, in your book, you draw a lot of attention, through the cultural studies perspective and Raymond Williams and others about the cultural context, right? Because it's not just an algorithm that helps you find the book you might be looking for. It's also something that kind of sets you up to think in a certain way. And so while, religious paradigms might have been the source of recommendations and suggestions, now it's very much the tech industry, which has its own sort of magical aura, depending on how you want to read it and conceive of it. To some people, it's definitely like a source of evil, and to others, it's a source of sort of potential utopia coming if we will just, let them be and let them have their sort of neoliberal way. So, yeah, not to dwell on that because that's not necessarily like the main point of your book, but I found it interesting that these suggestions seem to have a sort of magical power, first from maybe deities, now from Silicon Valley. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's great. I was totally fascinated by how recommendations get kind of discursively discussed or formed or framed as in these very extreme ways, as either having extreme power in one direction or the other. It's always either dystopian or utopian, in technology and religion. Might not be the main argument of the book, but it's a really big part of it is just trying to point out that that's not really true and that these technologies have nowhere near as much power as we give them. And we need to really start to think through like where our own human agency kind of lives within these algorithms. A lot of the journalism around algorithms, but also recommendation systems, sort of assumes that you are going to take the recommendation no matter what it is. And that's just not true. Sometimes you take them and sometimes you don't. And sometimes you laugh at them, or sometimes you use them against the recommender. That's a big part of the book, is just trying to make people see that these things, humans can have power over these recommenders. They're nowhere near as powerful as we like to assume.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say you take a sort of Foucauldian approach in the sense that you highlight that there's always resistance, even when there's these really powerful discourses that maybe, if we're not careful, may assume to be like, all powerful and inevitable. But there have been a lot of cases of resistance, whether that's the Babadook example that, I mean, maybe you can talk about, or maybe you can choose whatever example of resistance comes to mind for you most now. That's just in my head because I found that pretty funny and also strange. But yeah, there's lots of places where resistance is happening, and as you said, I don't think journalists, and I don't think a lot of people writing about this, whether in the tech industry or whether in cultural studies, are not necessarily focused on resistance aspect, especially to the extent that you do. So yeah, where do we see resistance, and how might we consider that?
Great. Yeah, I love the Babadook example. That's definitely my favorite one to pull out at parties. Yeah, I mean, so the Babadook, I think probably a lot of your listeners know that the Babadook has become like a queer icon somehow. And when I first saw that the Babadook had become a queer kind of, or was showing up at LGBT parades, I was very confused, but also pleased. And I was even more pleased when I discovered that the reason why, the original reason why the Babadook kind of started becoming a queer icon was because somebody at Netflix kind of either mistagged the Babadook as a queer film, and it like maybe sort of is, but it doesn't. I don't think anyone just picking up the Babadook would immediately read it as queer.
Mm-hmm.
But they tagged it as queer, whether by accident or not. And then it started showing up on people's LGBT list, along with things like other films like Room 237, which doesn't get as much play. But the Babadook got lifted onto Twitter and then started showing up everywhere. So that's a nice moment where just sort of randomness, the randomness of recommendations becomes a form of resistance in a way. I think it got very quickly kind of taken away from its, or for me, it was interesting that the resistance in the Babadook is not towards the recommendations themselves, or it's not really subversive of recommendation systems, but it took on its own life in a very emergent way that I don't think anyone could have predicted.
Yeah, so if anyone hasn't seen this and is curious, I laughed the first time I saw it because it was in your book that I was introduced to it. But yeah, you have this creepy horror figure, Babadook, and then it's been changed to say like love is love. Yeah.
Yeah, lots of very creepy guy, loves rainbows. At least now he does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
That's
maybe
right.
to be an LGBT. Yeah. But so there's a lot of elements of resistance that we can see. And I think in highlighting that in your book, you do a good job, of course, of going away from this utopian, mystical idea of like a future where everything is great, which some people might gravitate towards. I think more and more often now it's people gravitating towards the dystopian. We're all going to be like Terminator scenario if we let Amazon choose what books we want to read and stuff like that. How do you weigh sort of, I don't know if middle trajectory is accurate, because maybe in some cases things are worse and in some cases things are better. But how do you weigh like going between those two extremes?
I mean, that feels really tricky to me because I didn't want this book to be like, I was a little afraid that by focusing more on like human agency than in like structural oppression, it would make it sound like I was kind of like a Jordan Peterson type, something like that. And I think I try, instead of kind of doing a middle path, I present kind of both extremes rather than a middle. So like the technologies are scary. And if they did what people think that they do, then they would be terrifying. There are tons of tons of really bad examples all over the place. Part of the development of this book was it did start out way more kind of extreme, focused on like how these technologies were just neoliberal, post-feminist, post-racial kind of garbage that we need to destroy entirely. And that's still there, but over time I pushed the agency part more and more, both because that was part of the argument, or that was part of the debate that was getting kind of left out in a lot of scholarship. So with somebody like John Chaney Lippold's book, We Are Data, or Algorithms of Oppression, or What Algorithms Want, the focus is very much on kind of how, on all the terrible things that these algorithms are doing and the industries behind them are doing, and how we need to like really take a step back. And I totally agree with that. But I also felt like that focus was making it seem as if we had no agency at all, which seemed like it was causing more harm than good. I don't feel like I'm taking a middle path generally. I feel like I'm kind of vacillating wildly from an extreme of like the terrible things that these sites are doing, to talking about kind of the interesting things that other people are doing with those sites, even though they're terrible. Often it's parody.
Yeah.
To be honest, the subversion in this book, I wish I could have found more examples or more things that I could like really refer to as like really strong examples of subversion. But most of the stuff that is out there that's doing like algorithmic subversion is more at the level of parody, or or camp, or kind of poking fun at the algorithms rather than actively destroying the system that they're based on.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, you've already mentioned some of these systems or ways of viewing the systems as post-feminist, post-racial, neoliberalism as a sort of blanket statement. Can you say a little bit about what those things are, especially in relation to the discourses surrounding these algorithmic decision trees and the ways that they're suggesting things to us? Because after reading your book, it's perfectly clear. But to anyone who's hearing stuff, like post-feminism, post-racism, what does that have to do with Amazon and other recommendations, Netflix and what have you?
For real. Yeah, no, sounds good. Yeah, these are giant terms that get used all the time, and they're kind of meaningless, and that they suck everything into them. Post-feminism is a very vexed term, but it's important to me because that is kind of the area of scholarship where people talk about choice and agency the most, and especially around like white bourgeois kind of forms of freedom versus liberty versus imprisonment, or when are we making a choice versus when are we doing something that structures of society are just telling us is a choice. Post-feminism is generally like a wide variety of reactions to feminism, either positively or negatively. Some of the reactions in the 90s to kind of the wins in the 70s and 80s of feminists were kind of more of a pushback to say like, well, some women do want to stay at home, and some women do want to be sex objects, or some women don't want to do what other feminists want them to do. That was one strain of post-feminism. Another strain came from people like Bell Hooks, who were pointing out that a lot of the stuff that was going on in the 70s and 80s was really just focused on white rich people, and Black people, people of color across the globe were being kind of not addressed by that form of feminism. So they were trying to rectify the situation in a way, or broaden it out to more people. The kind of post-feminism that I tend to focus on in this book, or that I find most helpful, is the post-feminism that people like Angela McRobbie and Diane Negra and Yvonne Tasker focus on, where they focus on kind of the structural issues that emerged in the 90s and 2000s, with people trying to figure out women trying to figure out how to be successful during a period when everything felt really precarious, when there were less well-defined routes for success as a woman. So if one imagines that at some point the route for success to being a woman was to have children and become a housewife, which was probably never really true, but if that's if that was the fantasy, then in the 90s and 2000s, that sort of went away, and women were expected to kind of express more agency or do different things. But when you're asked to do different things with no safety net, it becomes much more traumatic and kind of anxiety inducing to figure out what you should do at all. I started seeing how a lot of the early recommendation systems, these technologies, were built specifically to help women kind of maintain their lives or take some of the anxiety out of their lives by either kind of helping them organize their schedules or by allowing them to stay in touch with their families more directly. In terms of schedules, you get a lot more professional, like women who start working in higher levels in offices as managers or as academics, and their schedules start kind of getting very wonky. They start having the issue of trying to figure out when they can do their work versus when they should be focusing on their family life versus all the other things they want to do. So automatic schedulers start showing up using recommendation systems to help them schedule their lives. That's an early use of recommendation systems. Mm-hmm. Thinking about neoliberalism, I was really thinking about ideas of precarity right now and how kind of the safety net has been dismantled. And without a safety net, and without unions also, the dismantling of so many of the things that made it possible for one to plan out their lives and feel safe about their choices or even know what a good choice was. So many of those roadmaps are gone. So what do people do now? How do people decide what a good choice in their life is? How do people plan ahead when things are constantly changing? Like, do people decide that they want to become engineers because that seems like a good route to success? And then a year later, all the engineers are out of work because nobody's building anything, or everyone wants to be doctors, but then doctors start having to work more and make less money, and their jobs start getting worse and worse. How do people live in a period when there's no good way to succeed or no obvious way? So the recommendation systems kind of stepped in there too as a way to say, like, we know you're anxious, and we know you're anxious because you're being expected to make these choices that you can't possibly make because there's no obvious right answer anymore. So we're going to help you make these choices for you. We're going to lift that burden off of you. At least that's kind of where the title comes from. And for post-racial, I was thinking about how these technologies always pretend to be colorblind and always, like, they don't take in race, but they take in everything else that one could possibly need to figure out what a person's race was, or at least hypothesize what it is. And they do that actively. There's a site on Google where you can see what Google thinks you are, like what demographic they've kind of calculated you as, which can help you figure out why they advertise to you in the way that they do. And that doesn't mean that they necessarily know that you are, a white 30-year-old male, but they might think that you're a 60-year-old Black woman, but that gives you a sense of like who they think you are. Also gives you a sense that they think that's important for whatever reason. But at the same time, these companies are continually stressing that they are colorblind and that race no longer matters and that everyone has equal opportunities and chances, even though that is simply not true. I mean, even for recommendations, period, like white people, especially, and affluent people tend to get more recommendations for things that are fancier than people who are Black or any person of color. So if you're a person of color on YouTube, you are on YouTube or on Facebook or Twitter, you are much more likely to get ads for Pearl services or bail services than you are for, like a Jaguar or a fancy vacation, something else that costs a ton of money.
I think that especially starts to get to some of the more, I don't want to say more serious issues, but the idea that, if I get a Jaguar ad or not, that doesn't seem like the end of the world. But in fact, a lot of these same issues that you're speaking about seem to have led to, if not the 2016 election, which it probably did, a number of other things that are going on that are, in some cases life or death in terms of how people are treated, how much jail time or whether or not they get jail time, these kinds of things. So how do we start to make that transition, like mentally thinking about it, from advertisements for luxury vehicles, for example, to, who gets elected and how they get elected? Because especially if you haven't studied this or read your book, it seems like a big jump, but actually they're very, very close.
Part of it is just about amplification. If you see a message over and over again, you start to take it more seriously. Even if you disagree with it, you start to like at least imagine that there are other people who seriously take it seriously. Trump is a great example of this, or Trump's all the paranoia and the crazy things that are out there online. If you are part of a group that, for whatever reason, Facebook or Amazon maybe less so, but Facebook or YouTube or Twitter thinks that you might be interested in other people and the ideas of other people who, I don't know, like who are members of the KKK or who think that Hillary Clinton is a child sex trafficker person, you will start to get a lot more ads and a lot more recommendations for things that start to stress that idea is legitimate to have. And that is scary. That is terrifying. The first 1,000 times you see that, you might think it's silly, but then the next 1,000, you might start to like at least read the articles and see what's there. I mean, for Facebook and Twitter, it's not just the ads too. It's how those sites order everything, what you see on like your first page or what's up at the top that you're most likely to look at. So if they bury all the good things that a particular group is doing, then you'll never know about it unless you directly search for it. And for whatever reason, people don't search for that much anymore. And even when you do search on a site like Google, Google's doing the same thing. They are ordering the things that they find for you in terms of what they think you specifically are going to most want to see. Sometimes, like even if they don't have any information about who you are, Google, if you're searching on a public computer at a library, they still know that you're at a public computer at a library, and they make certain decisions about what to show you based on that. So they might assume that you have less money, and they'll know where you are specifically in the world. So they'll advertise maybe fast food to you or something that they think that you can afford and that you'll want. In terms of Donald Trump, I mean, there are so many articles out there trying to figure out exactly how much effect all of this has played in his election. And it looks like it had an effect, but not a crazy huge effect. So it might have had the same amount of effect that buying a ton of billboards around a particular place. If you were seeing billboards constantly for one thing, that's basically the amount of effect it would have. It's not a crazy amount. That's one place where I think people do assume that these technologies have a lot more effect than they actually do. Like if you are a hardcore Hillary supporter, nothing any of these ads could have said would have dissuaded you from voting for her. The most they might have done is made you slightly less excited about trying to get other people to vote for her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I remember during that time, talking to students, especially like I teach in rural Georgia, a lot of them are brought up to be like really hardcore Republican, Christian conservatives. And so, I mean, I don't really share that background. And so when I'm watching YouTube or whatever, at the time we were seeing a lot of, so not dissimilar from today, police brutality, really disturbing issues like that, and then racist rhetoric coming from Trump and Trump supporters. And so like that's all basically I was seeing on YouTube. But then what I didn't realize until talking to some other people was that a number of my students were seeing Trump giving to charities. So I won't even get into the sort of objectivity of all of this, but what they were seeing was Trump giving to charities, Trump helping out in places, and then Trump supporters being attacked, often by people of color, like physically violent confrontations. They seem to be like actual cell phone footage. So, I mean, regardless about the truth and the numbers of these things, what struck me most was that I had seen a bunch of, racist rhetoric and a bunch of really disturbing things coming from basically Trump and Trump supporters. They had seen Trump supporters being attacked and mostly doing good things on their whatever stations or whatever recommendations they were getting. And then, just take a step back from that, because that's one of many examples of how we're sort of being put into these categories of what YouTube or what other recommendation systems think that we want to see. It does definitely become a sort of echo chamber. Getting back to this idea of resistance, other than, having that conversation with students, for example, a lot of people, I think, are at a loss as to what to do with that, because I don't really want to switch my preferences so that
Right.
I'll get a bunch of
Yeah.
pro-Trump ads or pro-Trump images and stuff like that. But I also, I mean, in order to understand why people are thinking a different way, I guess it's important to understand what they're seeing. I mean, and there's websites and stuff now, I'm sure you've seen, where it'll show you what like a Republican versus a Democrat will see on their Facebook feed, if that's like the information that Facebook has, and it's diametrically opposed in many cases. But again, yeah, Facebook isn't necessarily producing this stuff. YouTube isn't producing this themselves. And in many cases, I think they would argue, or they could argue, that people want to see this, right? And so where do we start to even think about improving this system, if at all?
I mean, that's a really good point, that a lot of people do want to see these things, and that it's based on kind of desire, all these recommendation systems. I mean, I think, yeah, toward the end of the book, I kind of like throw my hands up. I don't entirely know what to do. It seems like the right.
I think that's what I want to push you on a little too. Yeah, because I mean, you do mention that kind of stuff, and it has been a little while since you've been writing. So I'm wondering what you've been thinking since then.
So part of what's happened is like, yeah, it's created kind of a miniature civil war in our society, where people like a totally incoherent kind of world where a certain group of people, like whether they're Democrats or just the far left or even the middle left, can't even understand what the right is saying or thinking, or why they would think something. And the same thing on the other side. The right has no idea why the left thinks the things that they do. So it's created this like inability for us to communicate at a very basic level. One thing, I mean, and we're kind of watching how this is playing out right now. A lot of things are happening right now, but you start to see both the kind of the armed struggle that this has led to, but also people continually kind of finally seeing kind of a shared image and finally agreeing what that image means, which is nice to see, at least, of kind of police brutality. In terms of like, how do you make recommendations better? I think first, I'm feeling very, in my more kind of socialist moments or communist moments, I feel like you need to, like, recommendations are based on like a logic of desire and need, or a desire and want. So they have no interest in like what people need or what might make the world a better place. And like that would really need to be what these recommendation systems start taking into account. Like stuff like Twitter or Facebook trying to fact check stuff is not going to work, because people on one side or the other won't believe those fact checks, first of all. And they also like they lead you to more information that is easily disproved or proven if you are on one side or the other. But just like creating a way in which, like having a way in which you can create a dialogue would be incredibly valuable. Maybe taking out some of the personalization would be nice, oddly, both because it, I mean, the personalization is part of what, or at least the personalization that's based entirely on what you desire. If it's focused more on just like things that Facebook, I'm not, this is why I'm kind of stuck here. I don't know, because I don't want Facebook or Twitter to like start deciding what like humanity needs, because that's a terrible idea.
Yeah.
But left to our own devices, we're very bad at it as well. So I don't know. What do you think? Where would you go?
It brings up some interesting questions of, I mean, really big philosophical questions that, you know, could go back all the way to Kant or ancient Greece, of like, what is free will, and, you know, what is the best way that people can organize, and a number of other things like good leadership. I think one of the issues we're seeing is that, as you mentioned in the book, right? So choices are overwhelming, especially today. We have seemingly infinite choices, or at least some of us do. In having that, it creates this burden, and so this burden needs to be lifted if possible. And so places like Facebook, Twitter are lifting that burden by saying, you know, rather than the billions of people or the billions of tweets that are up here, we're going to direct you to the ones we think are best. And in all likelihood, they are best in the sense that, you know, if I'm interested in critical theory and people writing about algorithms, maybe I'll get led to your book. And I can't remember exactly where I first saw your book, but I'm pretty sure it was on Twitter or something. because I have those kinds of, likes and interests and shared understandings of people that I follow and people that follow me. So in some sense, this is a great thing. Going back to that whole idea of dystopia and utopia, right? It's a great thing because it's democratizing. Twitter's not telling me what to like. Twitter's just saying, here are other people that like similar things. Have you seen this book yet? So that's, sort of, wonderful. But it also seems to have led us to this place where I don't think anyone would have chosen. And so you get this weird sort of paradox where all it is people choosing, but somehow in people choosing, we've ended up at this place that nobody would have chosen, or very few people would have chosen, if at all. I don't think anyone would have. I don't know. When I think back to what 2020 is right now, I can't imagine anyone choosing this other than maybe a couple people who have benefited greatly.
Yeah.
But okay, so
true.
I guess what I'm curious about, though, is how you would think about the choices. I mean, you also mentioned in the book that it's not so much about the algorithm or even the processes and functions that are going on. It's much more about the sort of discourse about what they do and how they do it. So not what they do, but what they say they do. And so where did we go wrong? If we're giving everyone options and, helping them choose and personalizing things in a good way, how did we get to such a bad place?
Well, I think we were already here. Part of the reason why I wanted to make this book more of a history of these technologies is because I wanted to show how it was less the technologies that made us this way or that led us to this place than it was more just our kind of general culture. And the culture is what made these technologies look appealing, and the socio-political spaces out there. And then these technologies are kind of just allowing us to do what we would already want to do, probably, or what we would already be doing. They're just doing it a little bit more of an intensely in-your-face kind of way. Before these technologies, I was living in Oakland, in a relatively nice part of Oakland, but a part where I didn't quite realize how conservative a person could be, or what. I had no idea what a conservative culture really looked like. So in that way, that kind of filter bubble already existed. Now it's just kind of you can interact with it more in your own space. I don't know. It's the culture more generally that is scary. It's our lack of interest in talking to each other, or in kind of trying to say that it's okay to have different beliefs as long as you're not destroying somebody else's ability to live. It's okay to kind of do what you're doing, perhaps. I don't even know if that's true. We're at a weird moment.
No, exactly. We are at a super weird moment. And that's why I think books like yours are coming out, because people, academics in particular, are struggling to understand what's happening, to contextualize and historicize what's happening, and then maybe to think about what's potentially useful to go forward with, whether that's sort of attitudes or practices or activism or what have you. But maybe that's a good way to start taking the conversation is, what have you done maybe personally, if you want to get into that, or more broadly, what have you seen being done as a response to this that you think is promising, whether that's parody, like you said, which can be simple and easy and just a retweet or something. Maybe there's much bigger activism that you've been seeing, but now that we're in this situation that we are dealing with no matter what, whether we wanted it or not, what are some of the things that either you've been doing or you've been seeing people do that you think is promising?
Yeah, the big area of this book that I think needs more development, or that I'm trying to develop more in new projects, is around the subversive aspects, and trying to figure out all the different ways in which one can be subversive online, and kind of catalog them and amplify those efforts to make them seem less daunting to people. There are so many efforts online to kind of both make it a little bit more transparent what is going on with these algorithms, teach people a little bit more about how their experience of the internet is different from even their neighbors. Mm-hmm. I'm excited about efforts well, there's a book called Spotify Teardown that does a really good job of going into the algorithms that Spotify uses to recommend things to people, and also just going through their technologies to see how they handle the relationship between musicians and their fans. Americans. Can't remember his name, so sorry.
Yeah, I'll have to check this out. I just looked it up, and it's Maria Eriksson, Rasmus Fletcher, Anna Johansson, Pelle Snickers, I believe, and Patrick.
Perfect. Yeah.
Vonderoo. So yeah, it's a collaboration. It looks like.
Yeah, that group was able to do like really interesting things. Like they formed their own music label in order to get more access to Spotify's algorithms, and they were able to kind of do a little bit of kind of DH style hacking to see what was actually going on with the stuff that they were sending in to Spotify and how Spotify was using it. So more projects like that, just to like reveal what's going on underneath these black boxes, is always helpful. I'm really excited about all the kind of anti-monopolistic efforts that are going on all over the place, or the kind of the freeware kind of movement, just people trying to create alternatives to both expensive kinds of software, but also sites like Facebook, interested in things like Mastodon, like social networks where things are like completely, where there's no advertisements and there's no real central server, where everything is just kind of delocalized. Not sure what the right word for that is, but new efforts to think through like new ways of creating a social network. I'm excited about kind of well, during COVID, there's been so many interesting kind of ways of being subversive. Some of them are hugely funny. I'm a huge fan now of K-pop, entirely just because their fans seem to be so awesome, doing things like taking down the Dallas Police's iWatch app through just attacking it with tons and tons of K-pop videos. That's always great. Just teaching people how to be subversive. There's so many people out there trying to just teach people how to hack, how to phish, how to mess with the system in interesting ways. I feel like we're kind of at a moment where the more people who learn how to do this, the more possibility there will be for kind of more interesting and engaging transformations. I'm also excited about digital humanities as a nice place where this stuff is happening too. Just places like Goldsmith with their forensic architecture lab, where they have been doing things like using AI and machine learning to help locate the use of illegal grenades in different kinds of different YouTube videos to get the people who made these grenades in trouble. I love that kind of effort. Super fun and super useful. So there's a lot of stuff going on out there. Some of it's good, some of it's terrible, some of it's like, I don't know, some of it's nonsense. But I think the more people are talking about like the fact that personalization does not mean that we actually have any control over the stuff that we're getting, and trying to figure out new ways of expressing your agency online, I think that's the brightest spot I see.
Yeah, I think that's also, a good message to take away from the book, which can be, negative, obviously, in some senses, because there are a lot of negative aspects to these systems, these algorithmic recommendation systems. But there's also, as you point out, lots of room for subversive negotiation, resistance. And I think that's an important point that you raise, and that is clearly more and more relevant today in terms of what's possible. Because as more surveillance systems and as more issues become possible in terms of big data and big businesses, there's also a lot more possibility for resistance. And so I think that's a great way to sort of wrap up our conversation today. Making people aware of this is probably the most important thing, but then also thinking about how to resist in whatever way we think is most appropriate. I really appreciate you talking to me today, Jonathan, about your book.
No, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you.
Once again, thank you very much for listening to and supporting This Is Not a Pipe podcast. I really do appreciate people listening to it and sharing it with friends, recommending it to others who are interested in this kind of material. It can feel like a small group, I think, in many ways, people who are interested in the kinds of questions we're asking about critical theory, cultural studies. But when you actually think about all the people online and all the people around the world who are interested in pursuing these questions, it is actually quite a large and really diverse and interesting group. And so I've been very happy to speak to a number of different people in different places, and I hope that can continue into the new year. I have one final episode that I will share. I've been a little delayed in getting these things out the way I want to, which is typically every 2 weeks. But I have one final interview scheduled for December, and that's with Anna Pepard about her book Supersex, Sexuality, Fantasy, and the Superhero. It was a very fun interview. I just conducted it recently, and one I've been saving, a very special interview to start off the new year. I think everyone will benefit from thinking through this book as well. It's Scott Newstock's How to Think Like Shakespeare. So whether or not you're interested in Shakespeare per se, I think this is the perfect book for starting the new year in 2021. Hopefully it'll be a much better year. Hopefully we can come back a little refreshed and invigorated. I thank everyone for listening and taking part. As always, check out tinapp.org if you want to find out more about my guests, about what's coming up, and about what books they recommend. They always recommend 5 books, and that's always kind of fun to look at, to see what people are reading. Until next time, thanks for listening. I'm Chris Richardson. Cheers.